Hey everyone, welcome back to Evil Shadow. Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. The Victorian mansion stood silent, almost waiting for them. Emily and her family gazed at it in awe. The high, arched windows casting long shadows across the yard as they pulled into the overgrown driveway. It was perfect, large, secluded, just what they had dreamed of for years. As the moving truck rumbled to a stop, Emily couldn't shake the eerie sensation that the house was alive, watching their every move. Inside, the house was just as magnificent as they had imagined. The high ceilings, the grand staircase, and the ornate woodwork. Everything seemed to whisper stories of the past. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood, the kind of smell that seemed to settle in your lungs and never leave. "We're home," Emily whispered to herself, though something in her voice trembled. She couldn't quite place it. Was it excitement or something darker? Their first few days were spent unpacking, getting to know the house, and settling in. Mark, her husband, was already talking about turning the attic into a man cave. Emily had her own plans. She would make this house feel like a home. They were eager to start fresh, to leave behind the noise of the city. One evening, after a long day of sorting through boxes, Emily ventured into the attic. It was a cold, narrow space filled with old trunks and forgotten belongings. The air was stale, and the floorboards creaked with every step she took. But then, her eyes caught something out of place among the dust and shadows. At the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind an old armoire, was an intricately crafted dollhouse. It was small, about the size of a large coffee table with delicate furniture, tiny wallpapered walls, and tiny porcelain dolls. But what sent a chill down her spine was how perfect it was. The dolls, their faces painted with careful detail, looked eerily lifelike. The house itself seemed to mirror every detail of the mansion. She approached it, her breath catching in her throat as she examined the craftsmanship. The walls, the furniture, even the tiny curtains, they were all exact replicas of their new home. Emily felt an unsettling sense of déjà vu, as if she had seen it before, though she couldn't remember where. She reached out to touch it, and just as her fingers brushed the smooth wood, she felt a strange coldness seep into her skin. She pulled her hand back sharply, confused by the sudden chill. It wasn't just the attic air. It was as if the dollhouse was breathing. "Mom, what's this?" Lily, her young daughter, appeared in the doorway, her wide eyes fixed on the dollhouse. Emily quickly stood up, trying to shake off the discomfort she felt. "It's just an old toy, sweetie," Emily said, forcing a smile. "Let's leave it here. We don't need to play with it." But Lily didn't seem to hear her. She was already moving toward the dollhouse, her tiny hands reaching for the dolls. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she watched her daughter handle them, unaware of the strange energy that seemed to pulse from the house. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Emily found herself drawn back to the attic. She didn't know why. The dollhouse was still there, waiting. The room felt colder now, the shadows in the corners deeper. The soft glow of the single bulb flickered as she approached the dollhouse again. As she leaned over it, her eyes falling on the tiny furniture, she noticed something odd. The position of the dolls had changed. One of them, the small porcelain woman, was now standing by the tiny window, her face turned toward the attic door. Emily's stomach churned. Had she moved them? She couldn't remember. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doll, but something inside her recoiled. She hesitated, then pulled away. But as she turned to leave, she swore she heard a faint whisper from behind her. Low, breathy, almost imperceptible. A voice, or a memory calling her name. Emily spun around. The attic was silent, yet in the dim light, the dolls, they were watching her. The first night in the mansion felt too quiet. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house, though vast and beautiful, felt heavy with silence. Mark was already snoring softly beside her, but Emily's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something she couldn't see, but knew was there, lurking in the shadows. Around midnight, the house came alive. It started with a soft creak, a distant groan from the floorboards below. Then a tap, tap, tap. A steady rhythm echoed through the walls, like the sound of fingers drumming on the wood. Emily froze, straining to listen. Was it just the house settling? She tried to dismiss it, but the noise grew louder, as if the house itself were breathing, stretching, and shifting in its slumber. She turned to Mark, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Mark stirred, mumbling a response. "It's just a house, Emily. Old houses do that." But Emily knew it wasn't just a house. The sound was too deliberate, too persistent. And then came the scratching, like claws dragging across wood somewhere deep in the walls. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. It was as if the house had come alive, its heart beating in time with her own, drawing her closer into its darkness. The noise eventually faded, but the unease never left her. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching for something that wasn't there. She wrapped the blankets tighter around her, trying to ignore the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. The next morning, the family gathered in the kitchen for breakfast. Lily, their young daughter, was unusually quiet. She kept glancing over at the hallway, her eyes wide and nervous. Emily tried to dismiss it, but there was a certain look on her daughter's face, a look that made her heart skip a beat. "Mom, can I play with the dollhouse again?" Lily asked softly, her voice trembling. Emily smiled, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. "Sure, sweetheart. Just be careful with it." Lily ran up to the attic with a skip in her step, eager to play with the tiny figures. Emily followed her up the stairs, her thoughts lingering on the strange noises from last night. When they reached the attic, Emily froze. The dollhouse, which had been neatly arranged the night before, was now different. The dolls were no longer in the same positions. The porcelain woman, who had stood by the window, was now sitting in the miniature chair by the tiny fireplace. The tiny man, who had been positioned next to her, was now standing by the door, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the dolls. She could have sworn she had placed them all perfectly the night before. A chill ran down her spine as she looked at Lily, who was standing motionless in front of the dollhouse, staring at it with wide eyes. "Mom, they moved," Lily whispered. Emily tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the possibility that she had been mistaken when she had placed the dolls the night before. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Still, she told herself it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. The house was old. It creaked, it groaned, and it had a way of making them feel like they were being watched. But then came the tapping again, quiet at first, like the faintest knock from the other side of the wall. Emily glanced at Mark, who was still at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper, oblivious to the strange happenings. Lily was already lost in her own world, kneeling in front of the dollhouse, her small fingers gently moving the dolls around. It was then that Emily noticed something even stranger, something that made her blood run cold. The dolls, they were smiling, their painted faces twisted into expressions of silent amusement, as though they were alive, watching her every move. Emily closed her eyes, willing the feeling to pass. "It's just the house," she whispered to herself. "It's just the house." But deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. As the days passed, Emily tried to push aside the creeping dread that had settled over their home. But each night, the house felt more oppressive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. The creaks, the groans, the whispers, all of it grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. And then, the dollhouse began to change. It started subtly at first. A doll's position would shift in the night. A chair moved, but by the third night, the changes were unmistakable. Emily woke up to the sound of footsteps once again, this time accompanied by an eerie, low sound, like something scraping against wood. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed. Mark stirred beside her, but he didn't wake. The scratching noise grew louder, closer, until it felt as if the house was breathing in time with her. Emily's gaze was drawn to the attic door, which stood ajar, as if waiting for her. She couldn't resist. Slowly, she slid out of bed and crept upstairs, her feet barely making a sound on the creaky steps. When she reached the attic, her stomach twisted in knots. The dollhouse sat there, glowing faintly in the dim light. But the scene before her was far from peaceful. The dolls were no longer positioned in their usual spots. The porcelain woman, who had once stood by the window, was now sprawled across the miniature floor, her body contorted in an unnatural position. The tiny man, once standing by the door, was now kneeling beside her, his hand gripping the woman's wrist, as if forcing her to look at him. A scene of struggle, of violent intent, was being played out in the tiny wooden space. Emily stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The dolls seemed so lifelike now, as though they could move at any moment. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the figures. She could feel the chill in the air, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. A shiver ran down her spine as the dim light flickered overhead. Suddenly, a soft, nearly imperceptible whisper echoed through the room. The air grew thick, and for a moment, Emily thought she heard something, someone moving behind her. She whipped around, but the attic was empty. Nothing but the shadows. Her heart raced as she turned back to the dollhouse, only to see that the scene had changed again. Now, the man was standing over the woman, his hands wrapped around her throat, and her tiny painted face was contorted in an expression of horror. The dolls were no longer acting out simple scenes. They were reenacting something darker, something violent. The house had begun to mirror the movements of the dolls. Each night, the sounds grew more intense. The whispers became clearer, more urgent, as though the house itself was trying to tell her something. Emily began to notice the subtle connections, how the dollhouse's violent scenes seemed to happen in the house shortly after. One night, she heard the unmistakable sound of muffled screams from the hallway. She rushed out of her bedroom, her heart in her throat, but found nothing. The house was silent. But the very next morning, as she descended the stairs, she found a trail of broken glass leading to the living room. The mirror, shattered, the pieces scattered across the floor. In the dollhouse, the man had shattered the tiny mirror, the porcelain shards scattered around his feet. Her hands shook as she stared at the dollhouse, the pieces of their real-life tragedies playing out in miniature. Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The stories of the mansion's past began to surface in whispers. Rumors of the Holloway family, the original owners, who had vanished without a trace. Their disappearance had never been explained, but local lore spoke of strange happenings. Voices in the walls, objects moving on their own, and shadows that seemed to watch from the windows. The last known residents of the house had been found in the attic, their bodies twisted and contorted, just like the dolls in the house. The story was chilling, but it wasn't until now that Emily understood the terrifying truth. The dolls, the house, they were connected. The house was feeding on their fear, on their memories. It had always been this way, and the dolls were the manifestation of the house's malevolent will. They were trapped, and as the nights grew longer, As the house and the dollhouse continued to twist together, Emily feared they might never leave. The walls, it seemed, were closing in. The house was waiting. Days blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. Emily could feel it now, the suffocating presence of the house pressing in on them, closing in with every passing moment. The walls creaked louder at night, and the air grew colder, thick with the weight of something ancient and unforgiving. The dollhouse had stopped being just a strange object. It was a curse, an inescapable trap, and every day, the family found themselves being pulled deeper into its web. The house, it seemed, was toying with them. Every time Emily thought she could breathe, that things might return to normal, something shifted. The sounds at night grew louder, more frantic. The whispers that had once been faint now screamed in the dark, echoing through the halls, pleading for release. But there was no release, only the trap tightening. One night, Emily awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. She bolted upright, heart racing, her breath shallow. The same rhythmic footsteps she had heard before, only this time, they were in their room, in their house. She whipped her head toward Mark, but he was still sleeping beside her, unaware of the horror that surrounded them. It wasn't just the footsteps. There was something more, a chill in the air, a sense that they were not alone. A shadow moved across the room, stretching unnaturally as it passed. Emily held her breath, eyes fixed on the corner of the room. Nothing, but she felt it. It was there, watching her. She climbed out of bed, her skin prickling as she made her way toward the attic, drawn to the dollhouse. She didn't know why. She couldn't explain it. It was as if the house was calling to her, pulling her into its grasp, and she had no choice but to answer. When she reached the attic, her stomach twisted in horror. The dollhouse sat there, gleaming in the dim light, its tiny furniture arranged once again in a new and violent scene. The dolls, now almost lifelike in their expressions, had shifted into a gruesome tableau. The man was holding the woman's head in his hands, her eyes wide with terror. Her body was twisted, contorted in agony. Emily's hands shook as she reached for the dolls, trying to rearrange them back to where they had been. But the moment her fingers touched the porcelain, a cold jolt of energy shot through her. It was as if the house was rejecting her touch, forcing her to bear witness to its horrifying ritual. Suddenly, the house groaned, its walls shuddering as though in response to her actions. Emily backed away, heart pounding, only to find herself frozen in place. The air around her grew thick, oppressive, as though the house had come alive with anger. The walls seemed to close in on her, and before she could react, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Locked in, the house had trapped her, just as it had trapped Mark, just as it had trapped Lily. The more they struggled to escape, the more the dollhouse twisted their reality. The very house was alive, and it was playing a cruel game. Emily's chest tightened, her mind racing. She had to break free, but how? The house wasn't just holding them in. It was manipulating them, forcing them to relive the horrors of the past. Suddenly, a scream pierced the silence. Lily's voice echoed through the house, filled with terror and desperation. Emily bolted to the stairs, the panic surging through her veins. She found Lily in the hallway, frozen, staring wide-eyed at the dollhouse, sitting on the floor in front of her. "No, no, no," Emily whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The scene had changed again. This time, it wasn't just the man and the woman. Lily's tiny figure had been placed in the center of the room, and the dolls around her were reenacting a brutal scene of violence. The dolls were no longer mere toys. They were controlling everything, forcing Emily and her family to play out their twisted roles, reenacting the violent tragedies that had once occurred in this house. They were trapped, condemned to repeat the horrors that had taken place long before their arrival. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Emily, we can't escape. It's the house. It's controlling us. We're stuck here." Emily tried to reach for Lily, but as soon as her hand touched the small doll, a violent jolt of electricity shot through her, throwing her back into the wall. The room spun as the sound of the doll's laughter filled the air, high-pitched, mocking. The house was alive, and they were its prisoners. They were part of its cycle now, forced to replay the violent scenes of the past over and over again, until the house had consumed them completely. There was no escape, not for them, not for anyone. Emily could only watch in helpless horror as the dollhouse shifted once again, rearranging their fate. The days had turned into endless nights, the passage of time a blur of twisted shadows and flickering lights. The mansion no longer felt like a home. It was a prison, a living nightmare that consumed everything in its wake. Emily's once vibrant eyes had dulled, her face pale and gaunt from sleepless nights spent in terror. Mark had stopped speaking altogether, his once calm demeanor now replaced with a haunted look. And Lily had stopped crying. Each day, the family would wake, only to find that the horrors of the night before had seeped deeper into their lives. The dollhouse's violent scenes no longer felt like mere reenactments. They were their reality. The dolls were no longer distant, lifeless figures. They were them. The family was playing out the twisted history of the house, piece by piece, over and over again. Emily could no longer tell where the dollhouse ended and the world began. Was the man with the broken face standing beside her in the hallway a real person? Or was he one of the dolls come to life? Was the shattered mirror in the hallway the result of a struggle? Or was it just another reflection of the terror the house had forced them to relive? She wandered the halls in a daze, feeling the walls close in around her, as if the house were suffocating her, inch by inch. The whispers had turned to screams. The shadows had become figures, figures that watched, that waited, that laughed. Lily stood by the dollhouse one night, her tiny fingers moving the dolls with unnatural precision. Her eyes were vacant, unblinking. She no longer spoke. She only stared at the dolls, as if seeing something Emily couldn't. The dolls had taken on a life of their own, and they were now guiding her. "Lily?" Emily called softly, her voice shaking. "Sweetheart, please talk to me." But Lily didn't respond. She simply moved the dolls into positions that mirrored the family's own horrific fates. The man, his hands outstretched, ready to strike the woman, who cowered in the corner. Emily's blood ran cold. It was as though Lily was acting out what would happen to them. Then one night it happened. The house groaned, its walls bending and shifting, and Emily found herself in the attic once again. The dollhouse was there, but this time, something had changed. The dolls were no longer simply figures. They were alive, moving of their own accord. The tiny figures now looked up at her with eyes full of malice, their faces twisted in cruel, knowing grins. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as Emily reached out toward them. The moment her hand touched the dollhouse, a violent shock coursed through her. Her body jerked, her vision spinning as she fell to the floor. The room seemed to pulse, and Emily's heart pounded as if it was being pulled from her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound came. "Emily," Mark's voice cut through the chaos, weak and broken. She turned to him, but he wasn't himself. His eyes were wide with terror, and his skin had turned a sickly shade of gray. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice a rasp. "We can't escape." The dollhouse had consumed them. They were part of it now, trapped, forever bound to its twisted cycle. Emily looked at Lily, standing in the corner, her eyes empty, her face blank. There was no emotion left in her. She had become one with the dolls, one with the house. And then it came, the choice. The house, in all its malevolent power, had given them one final decision. They could become part of the dollhouse forever, dolls themselves, frozen in time, reenacting the horrors for eternity. Or they could perish, their bodies twisted and broken, consumed by the very house that had fed on their fear. The walls closed in tighter. Emily's breathing quickened as the choice weighed heavily on her. Mark's pleading eyes met hers, but she could see it in his face. He had already made his decision. There was no way out, no escape from this nightmare. With a cry, Emily reached for Mark's hand, pulling him toward the dollhouse, as if she could somehow stop the inevitable. But it was too late. The walls began to shake violently, the house groaning, as though it were alive, ready to claim its prize. Emily and Mark's bodies twisted unnaturally as the house took hold of them. Their screams filled the air, but they were drowned by the laughter of the dolls, who watched with cruel delight. In one final, violent rush, they became part of the house, part of the dollhouse. And Lily stood, her eyes now filled with that same cruel, knowing look. She smiled as the house closed in on her small body no longer her own, but just another doll to add to the collection. Another victim trapped in the house's endless cycle. The mansion stood silent once more, its walls breathing softly as the faint sound of laughter echoed through the halls. And the dollhouse, the cursed, horrific dollhouse, sat silently in the attic, awaiting its next victims. Alex stood at the rusted gates of Hollow Creek Manor, the wind howling through the overgrown trees and the heavy fog that clung to the earth. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and silent, like a shadow from another time. Its once grand architecture was now decayed, windows broken, and the walls seemed to sag under the weight of years gone by. Hollow Creek Manor had been abandoned for decades, yet something about it felt alive with secrets, with a history that refused to be forgotten. Alex was a journalist, eager for the big break that would propel his career, and Hollow Creek Manor had been a mystery for as long as anyone could remember. The story of the Holloway family, the wealthy owners who vanished without a trace one stormy night, had captivated the public for years. The authorities had never found any sign of foul play, and the house had stood empty ever since. But Alex had heard rumors, whispers about an evil force that had taken hold of the manor, about strange noises heard at night, and sightings of ghostly figures in the windows. It was the perfect story, one that would send shockwaves through the media world. With a deep breath, Alex stepped through the gates, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his feet the only sound in the oppressive silence. The manor towered over him as he walked towards the entrance, the heavy wooden door creaking in the wind as if welcoming him into its dark embrace. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Inside, the manor was a time capsule, frozen in the past. Dust hung thick in the air, settling on forgotten furniture and cracked mirrors. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the musty air. Alex pulled out his flashlight and scanned the room, the beam of light flickering over the decaying remnants of a once lavish life. An ornate chandelier, broken statues, and paintings that had long since lost their luster. He wandered deeper into the manor, each step creaking underfoot. His flashlight caught sight of an old, leather-bound journal resting on a wooden desk, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Alex's heart quickened as he picked it up, flipping through the pages with reverence. The entries were sparse at first, the handwriting neat and elegant, but as he read on, the tone shifted. The last few pages were more frantic, scribbled in a hurry, as though the writer was desperately trying to record something before time ran out. Alex's eyes scanned the final entry, and a chill ran down his spine. The words seemed to leap off the page, the handwriting more erratic, as though written in fear. There is something in the walls, something that watches, something that waits. The house is not empty, and it will not let us leave. It wants us. We are its prisoners now. I've heard the screams, but no one believes me. The Holloways are gone, but something far worse has taken their place. God help us all. If anyone finds this journal, know that the evil here cannot be escaped. It will find you. Alex's breath caught in his throat. His hand trembled as he turned the pages, searching for more, but there was nothing. The journal ended there, a final, unfinished warning that hung in the air like a specter. He set the journal down, his mind racing. The Holloway family's disappearance had never been explained, but now, reading these words, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker than a simple mystery had taken place within the walls of Hollow Creek Manor. He walked over to a stack of old newspapers on a nearby table, their edges curling and yellowed with age. One article caught his eye, the headline screaming out to him in bold letters. Holloway family vanishes without a trace. Foul play suspected. The article detailed the night of the family's disappearance, the storm that had swept through the region, the eerie silence that followed, and the search efforts that had turned up nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle. It was as if the family had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. Alex's heart began to race, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every passing moment. There was something about this place, something wrong that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The air felt thick, charged with a presence that seemed to grow more oppressive the deeper he ventured into the manor. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the shadows growing longer, darker, and colder. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the hall, a soft, distant whisper, barely audible above the creak of the old house. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. The whisper was like a voice, but it was too faint to make out. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper within the manor. Alex's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He could feel his instincts screaming at him to leave, to run, but something held him in place. He took a step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The whisper grew louder, clearer, a guttural sound that sent a shiver through his spine. It was almost as if the house itself was calling to him, beckoning him to uncover its dark secret. His footfalls echoed in the silence as he followed the sound, deeper into the manor's heart, where no one had dared to go for years. The floorboards groaned beneath him, the whispers growing louder with each step. But as he reached the door at the end of the hallway, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, from within the room, a cold, unseen hand pressed against his chest, pushing him back. Alex gasped, his breath coming in shallow, panic breaths. The door creaked open, and in the darkness beyond, he could see nothing but the faint outline of something watching him. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar, the sound of countless voices crying out in agony. Alex stumbled backward, heart racing, as the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. And then, the silence returned. But it was no longer a comforting silence. It was the silence of a place that had never let go of its past, a place that had buried its secrets in the dark, waiting for someone foolish enough to uncover them. Alex's flashlight trembled in his hand as he stepped deeper into the manor, each floorboard creaking under his weight, protesting the intrusion. The air was thick, heavy with dust, and the suffocating silence seemed to press in from all directions. He could feel something, though, something lurking just beyond his perception. The whispers from earlier still echoed in his mind, their faint, chilling cadence like the last remnants of a forgotten nightmare. The halls of Hollow Creek Manor stretched endlessly in front of him, a maze of decaying rooms and forgotten memories. He moved cautiously, not sure what to expect. only knowing that every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave. But his curiosity, driven by the haunting journal entries he had found, held him captive. As he moved through the darkened rooms, Alex's breath caught in his throat. The silence here was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong, unnatural. There was something pressing in around him, an invisible force that made every step feel like a violation of the house's long-forgotten slumber. A sudden chill ran down his spine. He paused, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the room. It was as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, but the cold seeped deeper, gnawing at his bones. And then, faint at first, like the rustle of wind through a distant forest, he heard it again. The whispering. It was low and indistinct, but there was no mistaking its source. It was coming from the walls. Alex's pulse quickened. He moved toward the source of the sound, his footsteps soft on the creaking wooden floor. He placed his hand on the wall, the coldness of the surface sinking into his skin. It was as if the house itself was alive in a way that was far darker than anything he could have imagined. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. But the only response was the faintest shifting of shadows. Alex's eyes darted to the corners of the room, where the darkness seemed to move, like living things that writhed and slithered just beyond his vision. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed forward. A sudden noise from upstairs caught his attention, a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. No one had lived here for years. No one, except for whatever dark presence still lingered in the manor. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly ascended the staircase, his every step echoing in the suffocating silence. As he reached the top, he felt the coldness intensify, the air growing thick with an unnatural heaviness. The hallway stretched out before him, and it was in that moment that Alex realized something was terribly wrong. The house wasn't just empty, it was watching him. The shadows, now darker and more oppressive, seemed to shift and pulse, as if the walls themselves were alive, reacting to his presence. The whispers grew louder, their words clearer now, but still too distorted to make sense of. It was then that he saw it, a door, half open, hidden at the end of the hallway. He approached it slowly, every muscle in his body tense, prepared for whatever awaited him on the other side. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but as Alex stepped forward, he felt something else. The presence, the oppressive weight of it, pressed in on him from all sides. His flashlight flickered and then died completely, plunging him into complete darkness. A cold laugh echoed in the distance, hollow and chilling, causing a wave of terror to crash over him. He was not alone. Whatever haunted this house, it was here, and it knew he was here too. Alex fumbled through his bag, pulling out a spare flashlight, his hands shaking as he clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and for a split second, he thought he saw something. Just a flicker, a shadow passing quickly across the far wall. He turned, his breath hitching. There in the corner of the room was an old chest. It was covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, the wood cracked and worn, but it stood out like it was waiting for him. Against every instinct in his body, Alex walked toward it. His fingers brushed against the chest's cold surface, and a chill ran through him, deeper than the cold that already filled the room. With a creak, the chest slowly opened, revealing a stack of old papers and brittle, yellowed books. Alex pulled one of the journals free, its leather cover cracked and worn. He flipped through the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. The journal spoke of families, generations of families who had lived in Hollow Creek Manor, each one meeting violent, untimely deaths. But there was more. Hidden beneath the surface, a darker tale. The manor itself had been built on cursed land, and the Holloway family, Alex learned, was the most recent to fall victim to the evil that thrived within the walls. One journal entry, written in a frantic hand, sent a cold shiver through Alex's spine. The house is awake. The walls move. It watches. It listens. And it knows everything. We are nothing but its playthings. The Holloways are the latest victims, but they won't be the last. The evil is ancient, and it will not rest until we are all consumed. Alex's hand trembled as he turned the page, but there was nothing more. The rest of the journal was filled with nonsensical ramblings, but the warning was clear. Hollow Creek Manor wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, a place that trapped its residents in an endless cycle of terror, feeding off their fear until there was nothing left. And in that moment, Alex realized that the manor wasn't just haunted by the ghosts of the past. It was a living, breathing entity, one that consumed everything it touched. The whispers grew louder, closer. The shadows pressed in from all sides, and Alex knew he had uncovered something far darker than he had ever imagined. But as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Alex stumbled through the darkened hallways of Hollow Creek Manor, his mind spinning, his thoughts tangled in the terrifying discoveries he had already made. The journals, the whispers, the flickering shadows. There was something more to this place than he had ever imagined. And now, something was happening to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just investigating the manor anymore. He was part of it, trapped in it. A sharp pain shot through his head, and he staggered, gripping the wall for support. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with a suffocating weight. He felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the very walls of the manor were closing in on him. And then, vision after vision began to flood his mind. The first one was violent and vivid. A dark, stormy night, the manor bathed in shadows. The Holloway family, terrified, running through the house, their faces twisted in fear. He could see them, father, mother, and 2 children, rushing through the hallway, but something was following them. Something that moved like smoke, an endless black void that twisted and slithered, wrapping itself around them. Their screams filled the air, desperate and full of agony. But no sound escaped their lips, only the hollow, empty echo of their pain, as if their screams were being consumed by the house itself. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, and his legs buckled beneath him as he tried to shake off the vision, but it was too late. He was there, in the house with them, the family, his eyes locked on their faces. Couldn't see him, but he could see them. He could feel their terror, their desperation, as they rushed through the rooms, desperately searching for escape. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies trembling, but their voices, he couldn't hear them, not clearly. Only whispers, like the walls themselves were swallowing their cries. And then, as quickly as it began, the vision faded. Alex gasped, the air thick and sour in his lungs. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but the world around him seemed to shift, like the walls themselves were warping and contorting. He stumbled forward, grasping for anything to steady himself, but the images continued. Flashes of faces, twisted, tortured, eyes wide with terror, as if the house was showing him the final moments of every soul it had claimed. The Holloways, yes, but countless others too, all of them trapped, caught in a never-ending cycle of terror. The same malevolent force that had taken the Holloways was now clawing its way into his mind. Alex could feel it, a presence, ancient and powerful, like 1,000 hands reaching into his thoughts, tearing at the edges of his sanity. He staggered into a room, the door slamming shut behind him. His heart raced as he spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hands, but there was nothing there. No shadows, no whispers, just an oppressive silence that pressed in from every direction. But even the silence was loud. It screamed at him. Alex's pulse quickened as he turned to face the far wall, where a large mirror hung, cracked and covered in dust. In the reflection, he could see it, a shape, a figure. Its outline was hazy at first, like smoke rising from the ground. But as Alex's eyes locked onto it, it became clearer. A humanoid shape, tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs long and stretched, like a grotesque puppet. The figure was watching him. Alex's breath caught in his throat as the figure's eyes, black, empty voids, locked onto his own. It moved slowly at first, but its presence was overwhelming. Alex could feel it, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The figure's mouth twisted into an awful grin, and Alex felt his entire body freeze, as if the air around him had solidified. The whispers began again, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. Words, no, not words, but emotions screamed through his mind. Pain, anger, despair, and something else, hunger. He understood then. The entity that haunted Hollow Creek Manor wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just the spirit of a single person or even a family. It was something older, something darker, something that fed on the fear and suffering of the living. An ancient force, trapped in this decaying house, waiting for someone foolish enough to uncover its secrets. And now it had found him. Alex's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he turned to run, but the room seemed to stretch and warp around him. The walls twisted, the air thickened, and the shadows reached out like fingers, closing in on him. He was no longer in control. The house had him. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, and as the pieces fell to the ground, they whispered his name, hissing through the air like thousands of voices, each one colder than the last. Alex's mind raced, but the whispers drowned out his thoughts. They were too loud, too powerful. Alex, Alex, they called, as if the house itself were mocking him. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. His body felt heavy, his mind numb with terror. The presence was everywhere now, inside his head, inside his skin. It was consuming him, pulling him into the darkness, and he knew, with horrifying clarity, that it wouldn't let him go. The Holloways had been its first victims, but they would not be the last. The entity was ancient, and now Alex understood that Hollow Creek Manor was more than just a house. It was a trap, a prison for souls, and once it had claimed one, it would never let go. His vision blurred, his breath shallow. The last thing he saw was the figure, standing just behind him in the shattered reflection of the mirror. Its eyes gleamed, black and empty, as it whispered its final words. Welcome home. Alex stumbled through the darkened hallways of Hollow Creek Manor, each step heavier than the last. The walls seemed to pulse around him, alive, breathing with a rhythm that he couldn't escape. The house had shifted. The once familiar hallways and rooms now felt alien, as if the manor itself had conspired to trap him inside. The air was thick, suffocating, and Alex's chest felt tight, each breath shallow. He couldn't remember how long he'd been here. Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning the moment the house had begun to warp around him. The shifting walls, the whispers, the shadow that followed his every move. He no longer knew what was real and what was imagined. The house was playing with him. No, not playing, hunting him. There were no more safe rooms, no more exits. He could feel it now, deep in his bones. The manor was alive, and it had claimed him. Every turn he made led him back to the same place, as if the house was rearranging itself to keep him trapped. The doors that had been wide open before now refused to budge. The windows were sealed tight, no light from the outside world able to break through. Alex tried to force the door open again, but it wouldn't move. His hands, slick with sweat, slid uselessly across the handle. Panic began to claw at him. He pounded against the door with both fists, his voice a raw scream. "Let me out, please." His cries echoed in the empty, oppressive silence. But there was no response, only the hollow sound of his own voice ringing back at him like an unwelcome guest. And then the whispers returned, louder, closer. Alex spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam of light flickering wildly. He could feel them, surrounding him, their cold breath on his neck. The shadows seemed to press in from every corner, moving in slow, deliberate waves. They had always been there, lurking just outside his sight, but now they were coming for him. "No, no, no," he muttered under his breath, backing away. The walls around him seemed to close in, the space shrinking with each passing second. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, overlapping and indistinct, but each one carried an unmistakable tone of malice. They didn't speak in words, they spoke in fear, in terror, in despair. And suddenly, Alex understood. The house, the entity, it wasn't just tormenting him for fun. It was feeding on him, feeding on his fear, his sanity. He staggered backward, his hands pressed against his ears, trying to block out the cacophony of voices that seemed to echo in his very mind. But it was impossible. The whispers were inside him now, weaving into his thoughts, making everything twist and distort. "Please, I need to get out." He turned again, desperate to find anything that could help him escape. But the hall stretched out endlessly before him, its endless maze of rooms now a prison, one that seemed to grow darker with each step he took. The floor beneath him creaked, and Alex froze. The shadows in the corners seemed to come to life, twisting and writhing like black smoke. Something moved. Something was there. Then he saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated unnaturally. It stood at the end of a hallway, its face hidden in darkness, but its presence was undeniable. It was watching him, waiting for him. The entity. "Get away from me," Alex shouted, his voice trembling with desperation, but his body felt paralyzed, unable to move. The figure inched closer, its shadowy form almost reaching out to him. A deep, hollow laugh echoed through the house, low and mocking, sending chills crawling down Alex's spine. The walls creaked again, a sound like 1,000 voices groaning in pain. The house wasn't just moving, it was alive. Alive with something ancient and malevolent, something that had waited for years for someone like him, someone who would unlock its secrets. Alex's thoughts began to unravel. His head spun as he tried to remember who he was, where he came from. Was he Alex? Was he even real? The walls seemed to press against his mind, tightening, crushing his thoughts like the weight of the house itself. The entity's power had taken hold of him, pulling him deeper into madness. "Alex, come closer." The voice was soft at first, a whisper in his ear, but it quickly grew louder. "We're waiting for you." He stumbled forward, his legs moving on their own, as if the house itself was controlling him. The figure was closer now, standing at the end of the hall, its eyes glowing like deep, empty pits. Alex's body felt numb, his vision blurred as his mind frayed, pieces of his reality slipping through his fingers like sand. He was losing himself. The house was eating him alive, devouring him from the inside out. "Please stop." His voice cracked, but there was no response. Only the sound of his footsteps, hollow and echoing in the endless void of the manor. And then, with a final, sickening lurch, the walls seemed to fold in on themselves, collapsing around him, dragging him into the dark. The light flickered out, and Alex's scream was swallowed by the darkness. The manor had claimed him, and in the shadows, 1,000 souls whispered in twisted unison as Hollow Creek Manor continued to feed. Alex's heart thudded violently against his chest as the walls of Hollow Creek Manor seemed to close in around him. The house was alive, alive with rage, alive with hunger, and it was squeezing the life out of him. His breath was shallow, his hands slick with sweat, but he could feel it now more than ever. The presence, the entity, pulling him into its grasp. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every corner of the manor seemed to whisper his name in a chorus of voices, each one colder than the last. The hallways had become a maze, a twisted labyrinth of endless rooms, each more claustrophobic than the last. The shadows loomed, stretching across the floor like dark tendrils, always just a step behind him. But this time, Alex didn't run. This time, he didn't turn away. He couldn't. The walls creaked, groaned, and he could feel them moving inwards, as if the house was closing its jaws around him. He wasn't sure how long he'd been trapped here, but he knew one thing for certain now. The house would never let him go. It had claimed too many before him, and it wasn't going to let him escape. But Alex had reached his breaking point. His mind was unraveling. The whispers that had once taunted him, now swirling in his ears like a relentless storm. The entity had been feeding on his fear, manipulating him, twisting his thoughts, driving him to the edge of madness. But now, something in him shifted. A dark, primal part of him rose to the surface. Alex wasn't afraid anymore. The shadowy figure loomed at the end of the hall, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its grin spreading wider, its twisted form emerging from the darkness. Alex's body trembled, but his hands balled into fists. He wasn't going to let it take him, not without a fight. The voice echoed in his mind, like 1,000 whispers of despair, urging him to give in. You cannot escape. You will never leave. But Alex stood tall, his pulse steady, even in the face of the creature. His mind was clear, his will strong. He understood now. The entity thrived on fear. It fed on it, and the only way to escape was to strip it of its power. No, Alex whispered, his voice steady. You don't control me anymore. With every word, the house seemed to recoil, the air growing colder. The walls shook, and for the first time since he entered the manor, Alex felt the pressure lift. The entity let out a low, guttural growl, the shadows shifting around him, trying to drag him back into the dark. But Alex wasn't backing down. Not now, not when he was so close. The house trembled violently, as if it were alive, writhing, twisting in pain, unwilling to let go of its prey. The walls crackled with energy, and the shadows grew in size and intensity, but Alex stood firm, his eyes locked on the figure. He could feel its eyes on him, a cold, suffocating gaze that sought to strip him of his very soul. I won't be afraid, Alex muttered, louder now, his voice gaining strength with every word. You can't have me. The entity's form shifted, the shadows moving like smoke, but it remained rooted in place, its grin widening, its hollow eyes glowing with malice. It spoke, but its words were barely intelligible, a garbled mess of anger and hunger. You will be mine, it hissed. Alex stepped forward, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure how he knew, but in that moment he understood. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for the souls of the lost, the ones who had succumbed to fear and despair. And the entity, the creature that had taken the Holloways, the others who had come before, was its warden, feeding off the terror of the living. But Alex wasn't going to feed it anymore. He closed his eyes, focusing all his thoughts on one thing: courage. He pushed the fear aside, let it fall away like a weight being lifted from his chest. For a moment, the darkness seemed to recede, the walls stopped closing in. The shadows hesitated, flickering, and in that instant, Alex made his choice. With a primal roar, he stepped forward, right into the heart of the shadows, no longer running, no longer afraid. The entity's growls intensified, the darkness swirling around him like a storm. But Alex was determined. He felt the power of the house, its grip tightening, pulling at him. But he wasn't going to let it win. He reached out with his mind, grabbing hold of the very essence of the manor. The walls trembled, the house groaned under the pressure, and the shadowy figure screamed, its form flickering and warping. "No!" The entity howled. "You cannot!" But it was too late. With a final, forceful surge of will, Alex shattered the illusion. The house screamed in agony, its walls shaking violently, the very foundation of the manor crumbling beneath him. The shadows writhed and twisted, the entity's grip on reality weakening, unraveling. The air was thick with a chilling silence. Alex collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, as the oppressive weight of the manor lifted. Slowly, cautiously, he opened his eyes. The darkness was gone. The manor was still, silent, dead. Alex looked around. He was free, but as he rose to his feet, a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, in the distance, just beyond the crumbling ruins of the manor, stood the faintest shadow. And for a moment, Alex swore he could hear the faintest whisper, "You will always be mine." But it was distant now, fading into the abyss where it belonged. Alex turned away and stepped into the light, leaving Hollow Creek Manor behind, knowing that the horrors within would never truly be gone. But for now, at least, he had escaped. Sam and Claire had been searching for weeks. They'd seen countless apartments, each one either too small or too expensive, until they stumbled upon the one in the old building on Maple Street. The apartment was spacious, more than enough room for the two of them, and perhaps most importantly, affordable. Too affordable, some would say, for such a prime location. But Sam, ever the optimist, saw it as their lucky break. They met with the landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thatcher, who seemed pleasant enough. She had a tired, worn expression, her eyes never quite meeting theirs as she showed them around. The building had a certain charm: creaky wooden floors, vintage wallpaper, and windows that overlooked a sleepy, quiet street. It was exactly what they had been hoping for, a place to start fresh, a new chapter in their lives. But there was one thing that struck them as odd. Room 207. The door to it was always locked. No one ever went in, and no one ever talked about it. Sam, curious by nature, tried to ask Mrs. Thatcher about it during the tour. But the moment the question left his mouth, her demeanor changed. Her smile faded, her eyes flickering with something like unease, and she quickly diverted the conversation to something else. "It's best not to ask about that room," she said, her voice strangely flat. "We don't need to disturb it." At first, Sam and Claire laughed it off. An old building like this must have its quirks. Maybe the room had some sort of history that no one wanted to revisit. But as they moved in and settled into their new home, that strange door, the locked room, began to gnaw at Sam's curiosity. Claire, on the other hand, wasn't so eager to dig into the building's past. She had her own reservations, but she kept them to herself. After all, they had their new life ahead of them. Why focus on something so trivial? The first few nights in the apartment were peaceful. The sound of the old building settling, the creaking of floorboards beneath their feet, it was all part of the charm. But as the days went on, strange things began to happen. It started with the noises, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniable once they began. Scratching sounds like something or someone was moving behind the walls. Sam dismissed it as the building's age settling, the pipes or the floorboards shifting with the weight of time. Claire wasn't so sure. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide open, listening to the faint rustling, the scratching that seemed to grow louder as the night deepened. But the real oddity came after a week of living in the apartment. One evening, Claire was alone in the living room, curled up with a book when she heard it. A soft knock at the door. Not from the front door, but from deep within the building. It came from the hallway just outside their apartment. The knock was faint, but unmistakable. She stood up, puzzled, and peered through the peephole in the door. There was nothing. No one. Just an empty hallway. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease settling in her chest. It must have been the building's old pipes, or maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But then she noticed something. There was a flicker, a shadow moving past the door, just beyond the crack of the hallway light. It was as if someone or something had passed by, but when she opened the door to check, there was nothing there. A chill ran down her spine, and the sensation that something wasn't quite right began to settle in her bones. She walked over to Sam, who had been in the kitchen, and told him what happened. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or some old building noise. But Claire wasn't convinced. There was something unsettling about this place, something they couldn't put their finger on. The next day, as Sam and Claire were unpacking, Claire ventured into the hallway. The odd knocking noise had returned, this time louder, more insistent. It echoed off the walls, as though coming from the direction of room 207. She turned toward it, drawn inexplicably to the door that never opened. But before she could take a step toward it, Sam called from the living room. "Hey Claire, I found something. You need to see this." Claire hesitated for a moment longer, her gaze still locked on the door to room 207. Something inside her urged her to move toward it, to find out what lay behind that door. But she shook the thought from her head and joined Sam in the living room. That night, as the apartment settled into silence, the knocking returned. But this time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from behind the door of room 207. The sound was slow at first, rhythmic, almost like a tapping, echoing through the walls. But as the night deepened, it grew louder, more urgent, as if something was trying to break free from the confines of that room. Sam bolted upright in bed, his heart hammering. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was just the house settling, but the knock was so real, so loud. He stood up and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he froze. The air had grown unnaturally cold, a chill creeping along his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and then, without warning, the knocking stopped. Everything was silent, for now at least. The days blurred into one another, the feeling of unease growing steadily, like a creeping shadow that never left their side. At first, Sam and Claire tried to ignore it, chalking up the oddities to the quirks of an old building. But as the strange happenings continued, it became impossible to deny that something was wrong, terribly wrong. It started with the footsteps. Late at night, when the world outside their apartment was still, Sam would wake to the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. At first, he thought it was just the building settling, but the pattern of the footsteps was too precise, too deliberate. It sounded like someone knows something was walking outside their door, its steps slow and methodical, like it was waiting for something. Sam would get out of bed and peer through the peephole, half expecting to see a neighbor or a late-night tenant. But every time, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. He'd shake his head, dismissing it as his mind playing tricks. But the sound of those footsteps would return again and again, each time more persistent, as though it were following them. Claire, too, began to hear the footsteps. She tried to ignore them at first, but the unsettling sensation that they were never alone at night became impossible to ignore. It was as if something or someone was always there, lurking just beyond their reach. Then came the flickering lights. One evening, as Claire sat on the couch reading, the lights in the living room flickered. At first, she thought it was just a power surge, but as the seconds passed, the flickering grew worse, until the lights began to stutter like a dying heartbeat. She reached for the switch, but the flickering didn't stop. The room grew darker with each passing moment, the shadows stretching across the walls like dark tendrils reaching out to claim her. "Sam," she called, her voice tight with fear. But Sam was already standing in the doorway, his face pale. He hadn't said anything, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He had seen it too. He had felt it. The lights finally snapped off, plunging the room into complete darkness. They stood frozen in the silence, the sound of their breathing the only thing they could hear. Claire's heart raced, and Sam could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They weren't alone. The room seemed to close in around them, the silence thick and suffocating. "Just the old wiring," Sam muttered, trying to shake off the panic that had crept into his voice. "Nothing to worry about." But Claire wasn't convinced. There was something wrong about this place, something that felt unnatural. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense of dread that refused to let go. Then came the cold spots. It started as a sudden chill that seemed to sweep through the apartment, but it was never just the air. It was as if the very walls of the apartment were breathing, cold air creeping from corners, curling around their ankles, lingering in dark corners of rooms, always just out of sight. Sam would move from room to room, trying to escape the cold, but it followed him, like an unseen presence that refused to let him go. One night, Claire was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she felt it, a cold draft sweeping over her, sending a shiver down her spine. The hair on her arm stood on end as she turned to face the source, but there was nothing there. The windows were shut, the door locked. Yet the cold remained, persistent, like it had a life of its own. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from a draft. No, this was something worse, something that felt alive. Sam came in from the living room, rubbing his arms to ward off the cold. "It's like the temperature's dropping in here," he said, his voice strained. "Do you feel it too?" Claire nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She had never felt anything like this before, the air thick with something she couldn't name. It felt wrong. Everything about the apartment felt wrong. But it wasn't just the strange noises or the cold spots that unsettled them. It was the feeling of being watched. Everywhere they went in the apartment, they couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was always behind them, always observing them from the shadows. They'd glance over their shoulders, half expecting to see a figure standing just out of reach. But when they turned, there was nothing, just the empty space around them, filled with an eerie stillness. They couldn't explain it, but the presence was there. Always. Sam, more skeptical than Claire, tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just the stress of moving in, the weight of the unfamiliar. But Claire knew better. She could feel it, that cold, suffocating presence that hovered around them, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the feeling grew unbearable. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, reaching for them like the fingers of some unseen force. Claire looked at Sam, her face pale. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's not right here." But Sam just stared ahead, his eyes wide with terror as the shadows in the room began to shift. Something was moving, something was waiting, and then, from the corner of the room, a voice, low and guttural, whispered their names. Sam, Claire. Their blood ran cold. The apartment wasn't just old. It was something else, something dark, and they had just scratched the surface. The air in the apartment seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Every corner, every creaking floorboard, every flicker of light felt as though it was drawing them closer to something terrible, something ancient. And Claire, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to the apartment than they had been told, decided to do what Sam had been too hesitant to do: dig into the building's past. It was a rainy afternoon when Claire found herself at the old library on Elm Street. the musty smell of paper and dust filling the air. She had spent the morning sorting through local archives, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain the strange happenings in their apartment. She had begun to suspect that there was more to the building than mere age or faulty wiring. The apartment, and room 207 in particular, felt like a living, breathing entity, one with a dark history. After hours of sifting through forgotten records and faded newspapers, she stumbled upon an article dated back to the early 1970s. The headline was short, almost blunt. Woman found dead in apartment 207. Mystery unsolved. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she read on. The article described the death of a woman named Margaret Hale, the previous tenant of room 207. She had been found dead in her apartment under strange circumstances. The authorities were baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. Nothing had been stolen, and there was no obvious cause of death. Just a lifeless body in that very room, a woman who had apparently died in her sleep. The article mentioned that the building's management had been reluctant to discuss Margaret's death. In fact, they had gone to great lengths to avoid any mention of it, refusing to cooperate with the police during their investigation. The official cause of death had been listed as natural causes, but Claire felt an unsettling chill as she read the words. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She continued searching, finding other newspaper clippings about the incident. One report claimed that several neighbors had heard strange noises coming from room 207 the night Margaret had died, scratching sounds, like something was clawing at the walls. Others said they had seen shadows moving inside her apartment through the window, shadows that didn't belong to any living person. The reports grew more cryptic as they went on, hinting at a presence in the room, an entity that seemed to linger long after Margaret's death. Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. She found a chilling detail. The building's record showed that room 207 had never been rented out after Margaret's death. For over 20 years, the room had remained locked, its door untouched, its secrets buried. There was no mention of any new tenants moving into the room, no indication that anyone had dared to live there since Margaret had died. In fact, the room had been sealed off in the building's official documents, though there were no explanations as to why. The building's management had refused to answer any questions about it, and for some reason, no one had ever bothered to investigate further. Claire felt a cold wave wash over her as she closed the file. She had been hoping for answers, but what she had uncovered only deepened the mystery. Margaret Hale's death was far from ordinary, and the strange occurrences in their apartment were starting to make sense. Perhaps too much sense. Could room 207 be haunted by the very entity that had claimed Margaret's life? Was it possible that whatever had killed her was still there, still waiting, still watching? She left the library with the weight of the knowledge pressing on her chest. Sam was at home, but Claire didn't know how she was going to explain what she had learned. She wasn't sure she even fully believed it herself, but the evidence was undeniable. The building's past was tainted with darkness, and whatever lingered in room 207 had a history of death. That night, Claire sat by the window, staring out at the city below. The rain had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Every sound in the apartment, every creak of the floor, every rustle of the curtains felt like a whisper from room 207. She couldn't shake the thought that whatever had happened to Margaret was far from over. It wasn't just the building that was haunted, it was room 207, and now it was her turn to be caught in its grip. Sam came home later that evening, his face drawn with exhaustion. He noticed the somber look in Claire's eyes and immediately sat down beside her, concern evident in his voice. "What happened?" he asked softly. Claire hesitated for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to tell him everything she had uncovered, but something held her back. Something told her that once she spoke the truth, it would be too late to turn back. "There's something wrong with this place, Sam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something happened in room 207. Something we can't explain." Sam's eyes flickered toward the hallway, toward the door that led to the room they had been forbidden to speak of. The shadows in the corner of the apartment seemed to grow darker. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been feeling it too." The room seemed to grow colder, as if it were listening, waiting for something. Claire's heart raced, and she stood up, unable to stay still. "We need to find out what really happened," she said, her voice trembling, "before it's too late." But as she turned toward the hallway, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from within room 207. Slow, steady, relentless, and Claire knew, with a sinking feeling, that whatever had been waiting for them was already here. The decision to investigate room 207 wasn't one they made lightly. But as the days passed, Sam and Claire's growing sense of dread could no longer be ignored. The strange occurrences had escalated to a terrifying point. The footsteps were no longer a nightly occurrence. Now, they could hear them throughout the day, soft, shuffling footsteps moving just behind them as they went about their daily routines. The flickering lights had become erratic, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to grow on their own, twisting and writhing like something alive. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, always lurking in the corners of the room, just beyond her vision. The cold spots followed her like a persistent chill, creeping over her skin and leaving her with an unbearable sense of isolation. She knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever haunted that room, whatever evil lingered in the walls of that apartment, had made it clear that it wasn't going to leave them alone. They had to face it. Sam and Claire stood before the door to room 207, their hearts pounding in their chests. The lock had been in place for years, but after everything they'd discovered, they knew that the building's management could no longer be trusted. With a sense of foreboding, Sam pried the lock open, the metal scraping against the wood with a sound that echoed through the hallway, loud and unnatural. The door creaked open, revealing a room untouched by time. Dust covered every surface like a blanket, the air thick and stale with the smell of neglect. The furniture, an old bed, a dresser, and a tarnished mirror, remained in place, frozen in time, as though the room had been abandoned in a hurry. The floorboards groaned underfoot as Claire stepped inside, her breath shallow as the oppressive silence wrapped around her. "Claire, are you sure about this?" Sam asked, his voice tense. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Claire didn't answer at first. She could barely focus on Sam's words, the air in the room feeling thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching longer and darker than she had ever seen. She could feel it, an energy, malevolent and cold, radiating from the very corners of the room. "I have to know," she whispered. "We have to know." As they moved deeper into the room, the temperature seemed to drop, the chill creeping into their bones. Claire felt it more acutely than Sam, as though the room itself was pulling the warmth from her body. She shivered, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the dust-covered dresser. Then it happened. A low whisper, almost inaudible at first, broke the silence. It was a voice, but not one that came from any living person. It was a whisper that crawled under her skin, seeping into her mind like poison. "Help me." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she turned, her eyes wide with fear. The air seemed to warp around them, the walls groaning as if in pain. Then, from the corner of her vision, a figure appeared. Faint at first, a shadow in the gloom. It moved slowly like something lost and searching, and then it came into focus. The figure of a woman, pale, gaunt, her face twisted with a silent scream, stood in the doorway. It was Margaret, but it wasn't just her appearance that chilled Claire to the bone. It was her eyes, hollow and empty, like deep, dark voids that stared into Claire's very soul. The woman's mouth moved, but no words came out, only a silent, desperate plea. "Please," Margaret's figure seemed to whisper, her hands reaching out as if begging for release. Claire's pulse quickened, her chest tightening with a deep, primal fear. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls pulsing like a heartbeat, as though the very house was alive, feeding off the terror that now gripped her. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move, frozen in place as the apparition slowly advanced. The temperature continued to plummet, until Claire could see her breath fog in the air, cold and sharp. "Sam," Claire managed to gasp, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." But Sam didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the figure of Margaret, his face pale, as though he was transfixed by something beyond his control. Claire turned to him, her heart hammering in her chest. But before she could reach him, the room seemed to tilt. The shadows lengthened, stretching toward them like black tendrils, reaching for their souls. Suddenly, the air became thick with a heavy, oppressive weight, suffocating them both. Claire felt something cold and unseen press against her chest, like a force trying to crush the life out of her. She gasped, struggling to breathe, as Margaret's ghostly figure loomed closer, her eyes locked onto Claire with an intensity that sent waves of terror through her body. The shadows surrounding Margaret twisted, growing more violent, like a storm ready to consume them. Claire's heart raced, and she could feel the invisible grip tightening around her, pulling her toward the figure. The entity, the one that had claimed Margaret's life, was now targeting her, and there was no escape. "Sam, please," Claire screamed, her voice hoarse with fear. But Sam remained still, frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though he couldn't hear her. It was as though the entity had him trapped, its malevolent force seeping into his very being. Claire struggled to break free, but it was no use. The more she fought, the stronger the pull became, like invisible hands dragging her closer to Margaret's hollow eyes, to the darkness that seemed to pulse with pure malice. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, fast and erratic, as though time was slipping away. And then, as the shadows closed in, Claire realized the truth. The entity was not just haunting room 207. It had been waiting for someone to come. It had been waiting for them. Claire was its next victim, and there was nothing she could do to escape its grasp. The air in room 207 was thick with the palpable weight of fear, the walls pressing in on Sam and Claire from all sides. The shadows swirled around them like a living thing, twisting and writhing with a hunger that seemed to deepen as the entity's presence grew stronger. Margaret's figure had vanished, but the malevolent energy that filled the room remained, and now it was more aggressive, more desperate. Sam and Claire stood frozen, trapped by the invisible force that gripped their minds and bodies. They had to escape, but they knew there was no simple exit. The door was locked, the hallway beyond seemed endless, and every time they tried to move, the shadows seemed to push them back, forcing them deeper into the room. The walls pulsed with a sickening rhythm, like a heartbeat, slow, steady, and unyielding. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and the weight of the room, its oppressive atmosphere, pressed down on her chest like a vice. The entity was toying with them, its presence felt in every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light. It was waiting for them to break. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something inside Claire clicked. The research, the history of the building, of Margaret's death, everything pointed to one thing. The entity wasn't just a ghost. It was something far older, far darker, an ancient force, a vengeful spirit that had taken residence in room 207, a place bound by the twisted fabric of time. And now, It was hungry for more souls. Her eyes widened in realization. There had to be a way to stop it, a way to release the spirit before it claimed them both. Sam, she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. We need to perform the ritual. Sam looked at her, his face pale, his eyes wild with fear. Ritual? What are you talking about? We can't. Yes, we can, Claire interrupted, her voice shaking but determined. I found it. I found the way to release it. But we have to do it now, before it's too late. She felt the shadows close in tighter, the temperature plummeting to a freezing cold that numbed her fingers and toes. The air was heavy, as if the entity was pushing against them, trying to stop them from moving. Sam hesitated for a moment longer, but the terror in Claire's eyes was enough to snap him into action. Okay, he said, voice hoarse. What do we need to do? Claire quickly rummaged through her bag, pulling out the small book she had found in the library, the one that contained the instructions for the ritual. She had barely skimmed through the pages, but she knew the steps. She could feel the ancient power in the words, the weight of what was required to stop the entity from claiming them. There's no turning back, Claire warned, her voice tight with fear. Once we start, we have to finish, no matter what. Sam nodded, his face grim. Let's do it. They set up the ritual in the center of the room, the shadows swirling like dark smoke around them. Claire could feel the eyes of the entity on them, watching, waiting. But she steeled herself, focusing on the words from the book. The first step was to draw a circle, an ancient protective symbol, on the floor with chalk, using the remaining light from the flickering candles to illuminate their movements. As Sam worked quickly to mark the floor, Claire gathered the other items, a handful of salt, a vial of holy water, and the small blade needed to complete the ritual. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, the temperature dropping even lower. Suddenly, a loud, guttural growl erupted from the shadows, sending a wave of icy terror through Claire's chest. The room trembled, and the lights flickered violently. The entity was angry now. It wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The growl intensified, morphing into a shrill, bone-chilling scream. The shadows in the corners of the room began to take shape, long, twisted limbs emerging from the darkness, reaching toward Claire and Sam with a hunger that no mortal being could understand. The entity wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Do it now, Claire screamed, her voice raw with fear. Hurry! Sam rushed to her side, holding the vial of holy water in one trembling hand and the blade in the other. Claire began to chant the incantation, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise of the entity's screams. She felt the power of the ritual coursing through her veins, but the entity fought back, its malevolent presence pushing against her with terrifying force. The room began to spin, the shadows pressing in on them like a living nightmare. The air became thick with darkness, and the temperature dropped even lower until their breath formed visible clouds in front of them. Claire's mind felt like it was unraveling, as though the room was warping around her, pulling her into a vortex of madness. Sam, she cried, but her voice was lost in the whirlwind of chaos. The entity was everywhere, inside their minds, inside the walls, inside the very air they breathed. But Sam's hands were steady. With one swift motion, he poured the holy water around the circle, then made a deep cut in his palm, spilling blood onto the floor. The room shook violently as the ritual reached its peak. The walls screamed, the shadows writhed in agony. Claire's heart raced as the entity roared in fury, but the ritual was nearly complete. She could feel the power of the incantation taking hold, the entity's presence weakening, its grip loosening as the circle of protection grew stronger. And then, with one final cry of torment, the entity exploded in a burst of darkness, the shadows dissipating like smoke in the wind. The room fell silent. Claire collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling, her mind reeling from the battle they had just fought. Sam was beside her in an instant, his face pale but relieved. They had done it. The entity was gone, for now. But as Claire sat in the stillness of the room, she knew that room 207 would never truly be free. The entity had been defeated, but the dark energy it had left behind would always linger. It was a place where the past and present collided, where vengeful spirits sought to claim the living. And though they had escaped this time, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the room would never forget its victims. And neither would they.